Welcome to our Halfling, where we talk about Lord of the Rings and a little bit about D&D, so let's get to it. Today we're going over Chapter 10 of the Sindar, and this chapter begins with us going back to check in on Thingol and Melian. So during this time, Elu Thingol is King Greymantle, and he's the king over all the elves of Beleriand. So as a little refresher, Thingol is Olwe. He was one of the Teleri. He was the leader of the Teleri, and on one of his journeys to go visit a kin, he gets sidetracked and meets Melian. So that's a really quick refresher. But he is now king over all the elves of Beleriand, from the mariners of Círdan to the Blue Mountains. And these are called the Sindar, or the Grey Elves of Starlit Beleriand. Though they are Moriquendi, which means that they never got to see the lights, they're elves that were in the dark, they are described as being the fairest and the wisest of all the elves of Middle-earth. Middle-earth was for the most part in the sleep of Yavanna, but in Beleriand, under Melian, there was life and joy. During the noon of Valinor, it is said that Luthien was born, and the white flowers of Nefertdil began to bloom. Next, we talk about the Awakening of Dwarves. So now, during the second age of Melchor's captivity, the dwarves awake, and they come from the Blue Mountains. The dwarves name themselves Khazad, and the Sindar, however, named the dwarves Nagrim, the stunted people, and Gunhirim, masters of stone. The dwarves have built great halls and mansions east of Ered Luin. Their cities they call Gabelgathol, but the Sindar call it Belegost, the Mickelberg, and their city Tum Munzahar, which the Sindar called Nograd, the Hollowbold. And their greatest city was Khazad-dûm, the Dwelf, or Hadholdrond, or Moria. This was only known to the elves by name. Very few elves actually went to Khazad-dûm. The dwarves of Nograd and Belegost came to Beleriand, and the elves were amazed by them. At this point, the elves thought that they were the only beings that talked and crafted, and so to see the dwarves was quite a shock to them. And the elves at the beginning did not understand what the dwarves were saying at all, and they felt that their language was very unlovely. But the dwarves were very fast to learn the elves' language, and very slow to share their own language, so it worked out. Few elves went to Nogrand and Belegost, but the dwarves, however, they make a great road past Mount Domd, following the river Askar, crossing Gelion at San Athrad, the Ford of Stones, where a battle would later take place. Thingol welcomed the dwarves, and they had a great friendship with a mutual benefit. Later, the dwarves do end up being more fond of the Noldor because of their love for Aule. While later the dwarves will be more known for and fond of working with gold and silver, at the beginning and currently they are more fond of working with iron and copper. And even from the very beginning, dwarves have always had a wonderful skill with metal and stone. Now at this point, Melian began to have foresight that their peace in their land would eventually come to an end, and she warns Thingol of this. And so Thingol goes to the dwarves of Belegost and asks for help in building a strong and safe kingly dwelling for him and his people. And the dwarves were eager to work with Thingol and the other Sindar. They felt that they were already paid by Melian's knowledge that she had bestowed upon them, as well as all the pearls that Thingol had given them, that he had retrieved from Círdan, from the Isle of Balar. And the dwarves at this point had never seen pearls before, and so they held these gems quite dear to themselves. And the greatest pearl was the size of a dove's egg, and it was called Nymphelos. The chief dwarf of Belegost held this most dear and treasured it more than a mountain of wealth. Therefore the dwarves built gladly in their own fashion for Thingol. The dwarves built Menegroth, the 1,000 caves between Neldoreth and Region that could only be entered by a gate that could only be entered via a bridge over a river. And here it says, but the elves also had part in that labor, and elves and dwarves together, each with their own skill, there wrought out the visions of Melion, images of the wonder and beauty of Valinor beyond the sea. The pillars of Menegroth were hewn in the likeness of the beaches of Arome, stalk, bow, and leaf, and they were lit with lanterns of gold. The nightingales sang there as in the gardens of Lorien, and there were fountains of silver and basins of marble, and floors of many-colored stones. Carven figures of beasts and birds there ran upon the walls, or climbed upon the pillars, or peered among the branches entwined with many flowers. And as the years passed, Melian and her maidens filled the halls with woven hangings, wherein could be read the deeds of the Valar, and many things that had befallen an artist since its beginning, and shadows of things that were yet to be. That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. So once Menegroth was built, the dwarves often came and explored Beleriand. Once built, the dwarves often came and explored Beleriand, except for the Falas, because they were not fond of the sea. It says that they hated the sound of the sea and feared it. So at this point, though, there is peace in Beleriand, and they have no news of what's going on in Valinor. So now we enter the third age of Melkor's captivity. The dwarves end up warning Thingol that the Valar have not totally gotten rid of all the evil in Angband, and that there are now fell beasts and other creatures that basically Melkor's army has been growing this whole time, and that Thingol's kindred that was up north has now fled from the plains to the hills. And there are some orcs that begin to cause trouble in Beleriand, but most ended up waiting for Melkor to come back. However, the elves believed that these were the Advari, or the unwilling, who became savage and wild, which was nearly true. So if you don't remember, the Advari are the elves at the very beginning at Cuavenin who decided not to go west towards Aman. And so the elves believe that these are the ones that end up becoming orcs, which the book says is partially true. That is what happened. So now Thingol goes to the dwarves of Nograd and asks them for weapons, that these were the greatest smiths, and that among them the best smith was Telchar. All the dwarves were warlike and unmatched in skill, even by the Noldor, in making weapons and mail, which mail was first made by the dwarves of Belegost. So the elves ended up learning also how to make weapons from the dwarves, but they never matched them in skill. And now that they're all armed and have weapons, they're able to drive off all of the fell beasts and evil creatures and create peace again in Beleriand. And now Thingol can store all of these weapons for later, and these weapons are so wonderfully and craftily made that they never dull, which ends up coming in handy later on. So now we take a flashback a little bit, and we go back to when the Teleri are now given an option to go with Olmo to Valinor. And if you remember, there was a certain group that decided no, they wanted to look for Olwe. They wanted to go look for who's now known as Thingol. And so they end up leaving, and that group was led by Lenwë, and the group was the Nandor, or the Forsaken. So little known is about their travels. It says that some lived in the woods by the Vale of the Great River, some lived by the sea, and some passed by Ered Nimras and went north and came to the land between Ered Luin and the far mountains of Mist. So they were woodland people with no weapons, and they were very afraid of the fell beasts. So the son of Lenwë, Denethor, hears a rumor of where Thingol might be. So he goes and he gathers all of his scattered host that he could, and he leads them over the mountains into Beleriand to go and find Thingol. And there they do find Thingol. Thingol welcomes the Nandor, and they live in Osirion, land of seven rivers. So many years of peace go with few tales, one of which, though, is of Daeron, the minstrel chief lore master of Thingol, who created runes. And the Sindar didn't have a whole lot of interest in it, but the dwarves did. And the dwarves treasured and loved the fact that he came up with these runes, and they called it Cirth and brought it back to their own people and were able to share that knowledge with their own people and for later generations. But it was seldom used by the Sindar, who didn't really use it until later during the days of the war. And the chapter says, "But of bliss and glad life there's little to be said before it ends, as works fair and wonderful while still they endure for eyes to see are their own record, and only when they are in peril or broken forever do they pass into song." The Sindar didn't use their written language very much, and so a lot was lost. But now we reach the beauty of Melion was at its peak. The beauty of Luthien is in its spring. There's great peace in the land. Every once in a while, they hear Orome and his horse Nahar, and they know that evil is being driven off and that they're safe. And that's kind of it. Otherwise, they really don't know what's going on with the Valar. That's as much as they get. It's just the sound of Orome keeping them safe. So now it says that peace is coming to an end. And now the chapter kind of does a recap of what we've already learned. It kind of recaps Melchor joining up with Ungoliant and then destroying the trees and then escaping. And it does say that the part where Ungoliant attacks Melchor and he gives out this loud cry that even those in Menegroth can hear his cry and they're filled with fear even though they don't really know where it's coming from. It does say when Ungoliant flees after being attacked by the Balrogs, that she gets closer to Menegroth and to their realm. But because of the power of Melian, it causes Ungoliant to flee to Neldoreth, or what is then called, or afterwards called, Ered Gorgoroth, or the Mountains of Terror. And it says that very few get even close to that land. And that here it's full of darkness and the waters are poisoned. And now we have Morgoth returning to Angband and creating Thangrodrim. And it says that even though this is 150 leagues away from Menegroth, it says that it is far and yet all too near. So now the orcs are ordered into, it says, the highlands of the north. And so now suddenly a great army is on Thingol. And the orcs end up cutting off Menegroth from Círdan, and it says that though many are in Menegroth, many are still out in all the lands. The book says, "Therefore he called upon Denethor, and the elves came in force from region upon Eros and from Osirian, and fought the first battle in the wars of Beleriand. And the eastern host of the orcs was taken between the armies of the Eldar, north of the Andram, and midway between Aros and Gelion, and there they were utterly defeated. And those that fled north from the great slaughter were waylaid by the axes of the Nagrim that issued from Mount Domed. Few indeed returned to Angband." And it says that though that there was victory, it came at a cost. And the elves of Osirian had light armor and were not prepared or even able to match the armor that the orcs had. And so Denethor was cut off on the hill of Amon Ereb, and there he was killed along with all of his kin that was with him. And they were there waiting for the aid of Thingol, but he came too late. But once Thingol got there, he avenged Denethor, and they slew the orcs in heaps. So Denethor's people grieved his death, and it says that they took no king afterward, and that some returned to Osirian and told the people there of what had happened, so that now everybody grew in fear. And because of this, they chose to live a life in secrecy and kind of pull away from everybody and to never go back into open war. And these were called the Laquendi, or the green elves, due to their leaf green raiments. However, many did end up going with Thingol back to Menegroth and merged with his people. So upon Thingol's return to Menegroth, he learns that the orcs were victorious over the Círdan and drove them out to the sea. So therefore, Thingol ends up summoning all of the people that he can reach to come back to Neldoreth in region. And here Melian puts forth her power and basically fences in this region, all of their domain. And this is called the Girdle of Melion, so that none could pass without Melian or Thingol's permission, unless they had greater power than Melian and could basically destroy that protection, that barrier. So now this land was Eglador and is now called Doriath, the guarded kingdom, land of the girdle. So within there was a watchful peace, it says. And outside of this barrier, basically Morgoth's servants were able to roam free, except for the walled havens of the Falas. At this point, there had been no news coming from Valinor during all of this. And at the same time that Melian is putting forth her girdle, Feanor is landing in the Firth of Dengrist, and here burns the ships at Lascar. So that's the end of this chapter. It was nice to get a break from Feanor and all of his nonsense. But I enjoyed getting to actually read the context and learn the context behind the Girdle of Melion. I've heard of it, of course, but it's nice to actually get the context behind it and like know where that came from. I enjoyed this chapter, and I hope you guys did too. And I'll see you guys next week. May the hair on your toes never fall out. Bye.